Okay, welcome everyone to Ironbark's webinar on councils acting on climate risk. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands we're joining from today. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people joining us today. I also acknowledge the deep and ongoing connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to country, community and culture. I'm on the lands of the Wadawurrung people, so feel free to enter in the chat where you are calling in from. I'm Lucy. I've been with Ironbark since forever, so since about 2010, working with councils on climate mitigation, sustainable buildings, and more recently, climate risk and adaptation. We've got some really fabulous speakers here today and people present as well, whom I'm going to introduce as we go along. Here are the topics for today. Please keep in mind we've got that optional Q&A for those who can remain from 1 to 1:30, and we should be all finished our presentations by 12:45 for some questions then as well. We do have a lot of attendees today, so if you can please mute yourself. We'll mainly answer questions once everyone has presented, but also we will try and address some throughout. So if you can please use the chat to post your questions as you think of them. We're recording this webinar, so it will be available post-webinar. And at the end of this presentation, we've created a couple of slides with links to key references. We'll be sharing these slides with you all. If you can please turn your camera on to make it more engaging for everyone. And I should just highlight that while we've done our best to summarize and detail relevant laws, we are not lawyers, so this isn't legal advice specific to each council. First of all, I'd like to send my sympathies to any individuals or communities impacted by climate change, be they those dealing with those chronic long-term climate change impacts like the drought, or those impacted by the current floods or other acute events. We've got over, I think, that should 210 registrations, and here's where you come from and what you said your understanding of climate risk is. Here's who's done what in terms of climate risk assessment and adaptation, with some distinction around whether they focus just on council assets and infrastructure or encompass those council services to the community. So the last two Ironbark webinars in this series introduced the international and Australian reporting standards and mainly focused on Scope 3 supply chain emissions. Now, today, we're going to focus on climate risk. We are likely to hold more webinars, so just stay tuned. And we also are issuing a white paper on climate reporting for councils, so keep an eye out for that via our newsletter. Let's get going. So there's plenty of national commitments and strategies that aren't legislation, but certainly clarify that councils have a role to address climate change risks. In terms of legislation, it's really easy to go down a wormhole looking for specific and explicit legislation on climate risk and also spend time interpreting various acts and reading literature. That's what I've done in preparation for this. I put some references in the PowerPoint for those interested, some of which might not necessarily cover your specific state or territory, but it's certainly useful for those wanting to improve their ability on interpreting their own acts. In a nutshell, all councils across Australia are mandated under their local government acts to identify and address climate risks through both their risk management and their duty of care mandates. So that's all councils. Here's a generalisation of what services are mandated in local government acts for councils to deliver. And you can see that climate change impacts all these services. So councils need to ensure they're making good decisions around how to effectively deliver these services. WA, when it comes to climate reporting, Victoria and Western Australia have more explicit requirements in their local government acts on planning for and responding to climate change. So definitely these states. In both these states, this responsibility flows through to various core functions like the work of audit and risk committees, municipal public health and wellbeing plans, and council plans. So white paper is going to drill down into that in a bit of detail, and I've also copied sections of the acts, references to them in our reference slide. We had a really good session with Charlotte Turner, who's here today. She brings over 10 years of legal experience focused on climate governance, risk and reporting. So she's worked at firms like Minter Ellison and Herbert Smith Freehills, and she's advised a lot of councils on their climate risk and disclosure obligations. So what she highlighted when we spoke is that because climate change is a foreseeable financial risk, inaction can expose councils to significant business risks. She groups them in three key financial risk areas of not addressing climate hazards. The first being physical events such as extreme weather events, damaging assets or disrupting services, leading to increased costs. Higher insurance premiums if assets aren't climate resilient, and legal exposure if councils can't show that they've made informed decisions on planning and services in relation to climate hazards. So Charlotte advised us that if a council can justify that they've followed due process in relation to decision making and reporting and clearly cite data sources and limitations, then they've got a good defence should they ever be challenged. You don't need to read this now. I know it's a very dense slide, but it does give you access to those key climate projections data if you're ever keen to do your own risk assessments. Climate trends and projections are what climate risk assessments are based on. And I'm just going to share some lessons based on our experience doing risk assessments. Don't forget there's also local sources like catchment authorities often do flood studies, or there might be a council study that's relevant to your area. Some of the states have projections and viewers which draw on more recent generation of modelling. But according to CSIRO, keep in mind that earlier projections aren't necessarily superseded by more recent updates, they're just complemented by them. Always document your sources, so your data sources. So if there's an uncertainty or conflicting data between two different sets, make your decision and clearly explain why. We also suggest that before embarking on a risk assessment, carefully consider what emissions pathways, scenarios to use, and what time frame. So the International and Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards may also inform what kind of pathway or scenario or time frame you use, and we're keeping track of that. So feel free to contact us if you want any guidance on this. There's three petals. The three petals of the IPCC risk framework of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure are probably what you're more familiar with, and it's certainly what's been covered in risk assessments to date. Recently, we're seeing an expansion to a fourth petal on responses to highlight how important our actions are, because they can either reduce the risk or amplify it. In Australia, the federal government's Climate Risk and Opportunity Management Program, known as CROMP, their materials echo this message, but they refer to responses as opportunities. Another important framing to be familiar with is the distinction between physical and transition risks. So you'll hear this terminology often. And we'd say that councils have generally done well in identifying physical risks, so risks relating to heat waves or floods or sea level rises. And whereas transition risks are probably only more recently documented. So these are around impacts of shifting to a low carbon economy. And they include stuff like the legal liabilities I spoke about in the previous page, or insurance costs, or reputational risks, stuff like that. Climate risk frameworks. I'm just spending a few seconds on this slide just to point out that everyone has theories on exactly what steps you need to take to identify and address climate risks, but they're all in agreement so that it's an iterative process and it requires continuous consultation throughout. Here's where risk assessments fit in. So they're generally a first step and then they're repeated. So when more detail is needed or when more information comes available or another issue comes up, then you repeat your risk assessment. I'm just going to talk to you about how risk assessments are typically carried out, and then Matt's going to go into some more detail later. They're often done in stages, so commonly referred to as first, second, and third pass assessments, moving from broad, high-level analysis to more detailed, localized assessments. We've used this framework in an upcoming slide that Matt will walk you through. So just keep in mind that first, second, and third pass framework. Key learnings based on the risk assessments we've been involved in is that you're not going to do a third pass on all risks. You just focus that level of depth where it matters most. Clarity is really critical when communicating with stakeholders. Too many risks will just overwhelm. I mean, we've identified, 75 risks for certain councils, and you really need to group them well and summarize them well for there to be any meaning to come out of your consultation. So what you can do is, for example, group them according to council service areas to make them more relevant for staff, or when you're communicating with community stakeholders, maybe group them according to hazards or impacts. So if you're meeting with a farming community, of course, you just focus on the hazards and impacts that affect them. Keep in mind that hazards don't work in isolation, so one event might increase the likelihood of another event, or different hazards might interact. For example, a drought might be followed by a bushfire, so that they're never isolated events. When you're outlining your risk treatments, just be careful about how you term them. So avoid duplicating similar actions that are just worded differently, because one treatment can often address multiple risks. So you just need to be careful of how you're wording them. Okay, there's a lot of different risk assessment tools out there, often called risk registers. I've put links to these on the icons. Of course, CROMP is a key tool now that's available online, and they also have an Excel version. Most of these tools will give you a solid second pass assessment, and Coast Adapt actually have a tool for each of the 3 pass types. Until recently, we have been using the New South Wales tool, and we've also kind of added some stuff to that to customize it specifically for councils. Now we'll more likely probably use CROMP as a starting point, and just because that's aligned with national sustainability reporting standards. Not to say the others aren't, but we know that one is. So each tool and approach has its strengths. It's probably good to have a look at a few of them, and we're happy to help you figure out what might work best for your council. It's also worth noting that some stages of a risk assessment can be done regionally. So for example, the first pass and a hazard identification in the second pass could be done as a region. And even, identifying vulnerable communities or areas within your local government area that are most exposed, sure, that's locally specific, but there's nothing stopping you commissioning that as a region as well, just making sure they drill down to that local level. So as I said, Matt's going to take you through some real world examples and explain how financial climate disclosure requirements can be integrated into a typical risk assessment process in a few minutes. But before he does, we've got Elise Kelly talking about how Mitchell Shire Council's climate risk assessment guided adaptation response. So Elise Kelly is the environment coordinator. Having started at Mitchell over 25 years ago, Elise has seen a lot of changes in growth and demographics of her shire. 25 years. I think that's amazing. Elise's passion is working with the diverse Mitchell community to protect the natural environment and adapt to climate change. So welcome, Elise.
Thanks so much, Lucy, and welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to be coming to you from Wurundjeri, Wurrung country today, and I want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging with that. So next slide, thank you. Yeah, so a little bit of background about Mitchell. As Lucy said there, Mitchell Shire is a fast growing municipality. Our population's around 64,000 at the moment, and it's to grow to 221,000 by 2046. So that in 20 years, that's a population growth of around 245%. So a little bit of some challenges and certainly some opportunities that come with that, which make it an exciting place to work. So we acknowledged climate emergency in 2021. We did our corporate net zero emissions options paper in 2022, which looked at our corporate pathways and then with lots of community and stakeholder engagement the following year adopted our Climate Emergency Action Plan with a net zero emissions target excluding landfill for 2030. Next slide, thank you. So the climate risk assessment was part of that. We identified 57, not 75, as Lucy said, at some councils have even more, but 57 climate risks were identified, including 3 extreme and 16 very high. They're the risks that we featured within the Climate Emergency Action Plan, and they are grouped according to council area, as Lucy spoke about, which was a good way to communicate that across the organisation. It's not just a plan that's implemented by the environment and sustainability teams, it's a whole of council approach. So we thought that was an important way to break it down. Next slide, please. Out of those high risks, our main ones, the greatest overall risks were extreme temperature and heat waves, bushfires and riverine flooding. We are a fire and flood affected community in Mitchell Shire, as are many areas of Australia, and actions to reduce the impact of these risks in particular were prioritised in our Climate Emergency Action Plan, and I'll provide a couple of examples shortly on how we're doing that in practice. Next slide, please. And one more click. Sorry, I don't know why it did that. Great. As I said, Mitchell Shire is a fire, flood and drought affected community. And I wanted to speak about the risk assessment as a communication piece. It's really been a good way to communicate and engage with community and councillors and politicians who may not want to speak about climate change or climate emergency, but can certainly speak about fire, flood and drought. It made it really real to our communities. It's something they could relate to and resonate with. It wasn't something happening over there. It was happening to them in their community, in their shire. It's also been a good way to get funding and grants and prioritise actions to reduce the impact of climate change. Ironically, there were floods the year before and the year after we adopted the Climate Emergency Action Plan. So it was really showing that this was a good communication piece and that actions against to mitigate and adapt to climate change were really important. Next slide. So some of the small examples that I'll give, just really basic operational ways that we're addressing our highest risk, which was extreme heat, how we're doing that in both the built form and in canopy cover. Next slide, please. So extreme heat, as I said, was our highest risk. With public health and well-being being the council area. The consequence was critical. The likelihood, sadly, is almost certain, and the risk rating's extreme. We're talking about loss of life in this. One of the ways that we've incorporated our risk assessment into our everyday operations is our decision-making matrix for our ESD and solar retrofits of our community facilities. One of those is we look at, is it a place of last resort or a neighbourhood safer place? I wasn't sure if this was a Victorian terminology or it was used more widely, but basically it's a place to go during an emergency and immediately after an emergency as well. We ask, is it a community recovery facility? So that is in the recovery phase, and we have several of those, including some of our major leisure centres. Does it provide refuge from heat waves? People, vulnerable people often come to our libraries or our aquatic centres during heat waves. So that's an important community service that we provide. And is it supported by community? I've got 2 photos there of Pylong and Tooborac, 2 of our smallest regional towns. And whilst there might not be thousands, not even hundreds of people visiting these, they're really important for those communities. And both of those are neighbourhood safer places. And I'm very pleased to say we were able to get state government funding to implement ESD actions on these buildings based on the service they provide to the community during and immediately after an emergency event. The other questions we ask are things like, you know, does the roof need to be repaired? Is it structurally sound? Is electrical upgrade needed? Is it free from shading? So this is just part of our decision-making process to prioritise our limited budget and our limited resources. Next slide, please. Build it right first time. So rather than going back and retrofitting, we're making sure what we build now moving forward and what we, when we change over different split systems, for example, are the most efficient we can be. For example, we're building 2 significant buildings over 15 million with government funding for those, and we're looking at minimum 5-star Green Star certified, which is quite ambitious for a council like Mitchell, but we're making sure it's built to last and it's sustainable in the face of climate change and can serve our community well into the future. Next slide. Urban forest strategy. So again, looking at reducing the urban heat island effect. That photo there is of a car park at a local primary school, clearly showing the thermal imaging, showing how beneficial shade is in our urban areas. And I've got the planting of the priority areas there, how we prioritise. And I wanted to bring your attention to one of those, which is the SEFA, the Socio-Economic Index for Areas, which looks at socio-economic advantage and disadvantage using census data. So that was just one of the layers that we used in identifying our priority areas to plant canopy trees. So really looking at the risk of extreme heat in our vulnerable communities and overlaying those. So again, limited money, limited resources, where can we get the best impact for our communities in the face of climate emergency? That's a map of Seymour, one of our regional centres, and I can clearly see in that socio-economic how that has reflected where we're going to plant first. Thank you. Next slide. So just a little bit of an honest reflection from me, and these are photos all of our community. We are flood, drought, fire affected, which has been a good way to communicate climate emergency with our community. That's a picture there of the Tubarak Hall again. So I just wanted to say that even though they're small communities, being able to undertake actions to make those buildings more sustainable. And it's not just during and after the event, it's making those community groups, if they're committees of management, more financially viable. And that builds resilience within our community for all the time in between emergencies where they can gather and build themselves as a community. I wanted to thank Ironbark particularly for asking me to speak because it prompted me to look at our risk assessment. And I said, that's a really good document. I should be using this a lot more. It's a great way to refresh my focus on what I'm doing, to keep doing some of the things we're doing in the biodiversity space or in our community education space, because they're always to identify climate risk. And the picture there of the community is just as a reminder, is that's what we're working for with local governments, the closest level of government to the community. Engage them and build resilience throughout the year, and also to make those buildings that they utilise and as gathering places more resilient to change. So I encourage all of you, if you haven't done a climate risk assessment, I would certainly recommend doing one. And for those who do have them, refocus, have another look like I have, because it really helps to build business cases to get important climate adaptation and mitigation projects off the ground. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elise. We are 1 minute ahead of time. Is there someone who wants to unmute and ask a question, or has there been one posted in the chat that anyone can read out? Imogen, if you've been keeping track of the...
None in the chat as yet. I
was going to ask Elise, in terms of identifying those key facilities as heat refuges, did you, I'm assuming it was just mainly, was it your libraries and your aquatic centres, and did you do some kind of audit just to see how they're standing up as heat wave refuges?
Thanks, Lucy. We haven't done that audit. We do have a heat plan, so it's part of that as well. And I guess looking across council, but there's always ideas for how to implement it better, and auditing those is a really great idea as well. Thanks.
Great.
I'm gonna
Okay, I've got.
jump in if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. It was really eye-opening. I just had one question around your risk assessment. How did you go about that? Did you engage your departments through that process, or did your team mainly look after that and then tell departments what you guys have identified? Just curious, because at Hume we're going through like a scenario development phase to try and bring out these climate risks.
Thanks, Nick. And I'll go back to Lucy's comment about regional risks. Hume's our neighbour, so some of our risk will be the same, which is great. We developed our risk assessment through the development of our Climate Emergency Action Plan, so did engage across council with internal departments through that process, especially our risk team through that. And we did look at benchmarking with others, but yeah, we certainly worked in. And I think that's really important. So it's not a standalone plan that's delivered by one team. It's accepted across the organisation and embedded.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. I can see some questions coming in, but I do want to stick to time. So thanks, Elise. Elise will be on hand to answer those questions in the chat. But we'll move on to my colleague, Matt Sullivan, who's going to talk you through some local government climate-related mandatory reporting.
Hi, everyone. It's Matt. Are we able to progress the slide at all? It's okay. I can recall it from memory.
So you guys can't see the slide?
We can see a slide.
I can see local government climate-related mandatory reporting. Is that the one?
Yeah, that's just come up. Great. Okay, so okay. Is it okay if you just move? Yeah. So I have been instructed to maintain a tight ship on this. I think those of you who know me know that I would go for a very long time on these topics, but I'm on the clock. So as you would be aware, the new accounting standards for reporting on climate-related risks has come in Australia. It's known as the ASB S2. It's got a long and storied history internationally, but it's got a very strong international backing, which will become important for reasons that won't relate to this presentation. So that outlines what organisations have to do in relation to the action that they're taking around climate change and how they're reporting on that action. There is a new white paper out, the ASRS, which is how that gets converted into what's going to be expected for government entities, particularly local governments. So we are seeing that sort of enter a formalised expectation. Generally, our attitude at Iron Park is that a good position to have is that this reporting standard, or a very close version of this, will become an expectation for local governments. And so it's a good idea to get across what it involves. Next.
Okay, I'll click next. Can you see next?
Yes. So to very broadly recap, the ASRS reporting regime has three main areas of focus. The first one is emissions reporting with the scope 3. We've discussed it before, so I'll keep very light on that. The second one, which is the majority of what's being presented today, what we're sort of talking about, is the risk and opportunity scenarios and the associated reporting around that. So the standard expects there to be two different scenarios explored. At least one of them are high emissions with 2050 timeline at least. And it's looking at that physical and transition risk, so covering, the adaptation components and the mitigation and mitigation risk components. Also, importantly, it does need to be whole of organisation. So that means, like, the documentation is very clear that when referring to risks and referring to, say, the organisational response to those risks, mitigation, risk treatment, that it's looking through the lens of the whole org, and it is quantified as well. So it's looking for actual value, quantified financial costs identified with these hazards, quantified financial outlays for the treatments and responses. And there's also, very importantly, and making up a large amount of the ASRS, is the governance. So it's talking about how is climate risk integrated into decision-making up to the executive. What is the information flows? What information do they have to act on? How are they implementing change? What's their feedback mechanisms? For local government in general, the governments probably won't be too challenging for most local governments, but it is definitely something that will need to be considered because it's not something you can just retroactively do. You sort of need to have it integrated into the organizational structure. Next. So, looking at the climate scenarios and risks, we've already had some really great presentations on this that have discussed how to approach it. What I would say is a good way to look at the ASRS and the associated tools, such as CROMP and some of those other tools that are increasingly coming online, is basically just being systematic to make sure that you're thinking about all the different risks, how they can manifest, and being sensibly progressing through preliminary assessment through to more detailed assessment, ensuring you're covering all your bases. So we just run through a very quick example of how the ASRS would look at something like a pedestrian bridge. So using the framework of the first, second, third pass, the first pass will identify, say, for this locality, that there is going to be flood risk and inundation risks for that region. Doing a second pass, so you've looked at all the possible risks, you've said flood risks is a big problem for us. Doing a second pass identifies specifically where those flood risks are going to occur. And it is through that pass that the bridge is identified as going to be subject to inundation, like an elevated inundation risk. Because it's a specific site that potentially has technical implications, you would then look to implement a third pass, which is like a site-specific assessment, and to do a detailed investigation about what the flooding implications are for that bridge, its infrastructure, and start looking at treatments and other scenarios that you could use to mitigate that risk or potentially implement alternative services. So really, if to get in the right headspace about what the right level of the pass is to get to a place where you have some confidence about what the costs are, both the costs of the risks unfolding or the treatments that you're going to be implementing for that. So you can understand it as being like there's an acute risk or a chronic risk, acute risk associated with like those emergency events, like flood events, bushfires, etc., and the costs implications associated with those events occurring at a more frequent interval, occurring with elevated intensity. And then chronic risk is just where there is a long-term deviation from the environment, what it's been like, that could, through the combination of looking at those risks, you would explore what appropriate responses are. You've got alternate scenarios. This particular pedestrian bridge, you might look at simply just if the elevated risk interval is not that high, you might just look to do a transference for the risk. So just manage that through an insurance program, insuring the installation and repairing as needed. It could be that the risk is so high that you need to relocate the bridge or potentially not even have that pedestrian pathway with implications on engagement and connection to the community. An alternative scenario that was brought to our attention by Paul is what Daniel has done, which is in one bridge he knows about that is subject to routine flooding. They changed the infrastructure of the bridge so that the railings of the bridge were attached with shearable pins that during flood events, the pins would just break. The railings would collapse in an anticipated manner while the flooding event occurred. And then once the flood was over, the bridge could be reassembled at very low cost and low time, thus making it sort of adapted to that flooding event, which I thought was very clever. And I think it'd be great to see more solutions like that rolling out. All of this, obviously, as you've identified the risks, the treatments, and then the outcomes, residual risks, is communicated to the residents. Were you going to say something?
Sorry, I flipped to the next slide. That wasn't a message at all. It was an accident.
Oh, that's okay. And then coming out of all of this is the costs and the reporting associated with this. So reporting, according to the ASRS, is done on an annual basis, or the same interval as your financial documents. And so that reporting will include those identified costs and risks of those climatic impacts and the treatments of those. So we've already had this highlighted most excellently through Mitchum. sorry, Mitchell Council. But sorry, can you go to the next slide, to the one with the heat mapping?
Sure. Yep.
So this is just an example about some of the analysis that you might typically see taking effect, where we have that identified as identified with Mitchell, the elevated heat risk, and then looking at how that concords with the vulnerabilities within the community. So this is looking at those low-income houses. This map here is for Penrith, and it's looking at a middle scenario heat mapping sort of urban heat index intersection between the data sets. And so by running these intersections, what can happen is it can allow for risks to be very quickly narrowed down to specific areas of concern. So through this mapping exercise, we're able to identify that for the most elevated risk profile, there's actually only 0.3% of the total housing stock that meets that elevated risk profile. And so that can then be used to shape a very targeted engagement strategy. So this is the sort of insight you would get from like a second pass assessment, which is typically informed by GIS datasets and mapping of enumerated risks onto geospatial distributions. Next. What is the next slide?
It's the Queensland Council.
Yes, so talking about the Queensland Council. So Queensland obviously has lots of challenging situations coming up ahead with a result of climate change. As a result of this, there's been some excellent work done over the recent years using their CHAS, the Coastal Hazard Adaptation Studies, funded and aided through the Queensland government and implemented by the coastal councils in Queensland. I think these are amazing. These are really, really great reports for a whole bunch of reasons. And they're one thing I really like about them is how effective the engagement with the community is, communications of the identified risks and the response to those risks are communicated to the community. I definitely use them as reference. This here is an example of a study that was undertaken by Mackay, like a third pass assessment of risks and responses. So in this instance, they've identified that they've got a whole host of landfills that are potentially subject to inundation as a result of climate change. They've done a very detailed geospatial mapping of what those potential hazards are. As you can see, just in this detail, you don't need to memorize it. Tables here, they've identified where their primary risks are located. And then through that, being able to establish very quantified plans with a time-based response as to how they're going to manage those risks. And so that overall is ample foundation for responding to the ASRS S2 expectations about the exposure to those anticipated climate risks. Next. So here is a slide that potentially looks a little confusing, but this is our best attempt to summarize what the workflow looks like for applying these stages of climate risk assessments and adaptation planning and reporting. So essentially, you'll go through a first pass assessment to just identify risks and get a broad understanding about like where your response areas need to be located. The second pass will be getting more granular about specific high priority risks as they apply to systems and services within the community and the council services and operations. And the third pass will be once you've identified from the second pass specific locations, facilities, assets that will need to have more technical assessments done because they may likely require some infrastructure changes or some sort of investment to be able to respond to those risks. From those assessments, you then have the basis of developing your climate risk adaptation plan, which will incorporate your incorporate all the actions that you plan to do. as well as then refactoring in what the residual risks associated from those identified in the climate risk assessment subject to those treatments, and then establishing communications and engagement plans from there. That'll form your climate risk adaptation plan. And then from that, having completed those stages, you will then have all the information you need for the ASRS S2 reporting, or the government equivalent, which will then sort of essentially form periodic updates about the status of that plan and how it's tracking and implementation. So that was it. I've come in slightly under time.
Well done, Matt. I'm sorry about the slide kerfuffle. I was multitasking
okay.
then. Great, thank you. All right, we are going to move on. And I appreciate all the chat. Before I introduce Yael, it looks like in the chat there's a lot of popularity for City of Campbelltown's Cool Spaces document. So perhaps, Maria, if you can send us a copy, perhaps we can have that as an attachment as well. So without further ado, next up is Yael Lang, Coordinator of Sustainability and Resilience at Blacktown City Council. So Yael has stepped into the role following Nelson Nolan and is now leading the integration of climate risk management and adaptation across council. They've just recently been awarded some funding from the Disaster Ready Fund, so congratulations. And Yael, looking forward to what you have to share today.
Thanks, Lucy. You can hear me? Everyone can hear me? Yep.
Yeah.
So, yes, thanks for the introduction. It's a real treat to be here to present to you all and to present this information on behalf of Blacktown Council. So I'll just be, I don't have much time, so I'll just be presenting quickly a brief outline on Blacktown Council, why we chose to voluntarily report, what we did so far, and our next steps. Next. So reporting was seen as showing leadership and having foresight. So although local governments were exempt, based on the proposed thresholds, so those companies required to report first, Blacktown would fall under Group 1. So the threshold for Group 1 are those businesses that have over 500 employees. We have 2,300. Have an asset value of over 1 billion. We hold approximately 7 billion in assets, have an annual expense of over 500 million. Ours was approximately 648 million in 24 and 25. So Council already voluntarily reports. We report to the Carbon Disclosure Project. We have achieved Climate Active certification for the last 4 years for being carbon neutral in our operations, and we are also committed to net zero emissions. So in our last year's annual report, we included a whole section, dedicated to our climate-related financial disclosures, and that included our governance structures and responsibilities, our transparency commitments, our mission, performance and progress, as well as our risk profiles. Next. So our risk management and what we did, we engaged a consultant and completed a preliminary climate risk assessment, identifying both current and future risks. The work was complemented by the insights from the New South Wales State Disaster Mitigation Plan. And the risks modelled included variations in rainfall intensity and heat waves, drought and bushfires. We used the climate data sources that we used to model this was the NARCLIM 1.0 and the CSIRO climate futures. And we used the IPCC scenario of the RCP 4.5 pathways. So if you have a look at this bar chart on the screen, we identified 50 risks and assessed them for consequence, likelihood and effectiveness of existing controls. So clearly the bar chart just shows that, if we don't act, these risks are going to get worse. What we found, some of our key risks is flooding of low-lying areas, accelerated degradation of our roads from heat, rising insurance premiums, and damage to our water-sensitive urban design from assets from flooding and heat. Next. So the risks were categorised across 3 key areas. Assets, so risks to the built and living assets owned and managed by council, corporate services, so planning, emergency management, legals, insurance, and community services, community wellbeing and environment. So the big question, though, is what are the financial implications of these of climate change on these areas? So for context, we had the New South Wales State Disaster Mitigation Plan, and that estimated that Western Sydney incurs around 85 million annually in damages from climate hazards, mostly from storms. And the figure could rise to 253 million per year by 2060 without any kind of adaptation. Next. So where are we going to now? So we really need to focus on quantifying the financial impacts, particularly the damage to infrastructure and property, disruption to services, and increased insurance premiums. So as was mentioned, we have received some funding from the Disaster Ready Fund, and we will be going on to do our multi-hazard climate change risk assessment, which will hopefully feed into our climate change adaptation plan. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
And there's a link to our annual
Yeah.
report where it has the section of that information in there.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Yael. It's really great to see a real life example of what those financial disclosures look like, and the fact that you'll be doing it every year as part of your annual report. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to questions and answers. We actually have until 1:30 for anyone who wants to stay behind until then. Otherwise, we understand that some of you might have to leave after the official hour ends at 1 p.m. I'm just going to perhaps ask my colleague Imogen to help me facilitate this bit. I didn't realize that driving the slides take up a bit of my mental energy. So Imogen, do you want to call out any questions that you see so far?
People have been quite responsive in the chat, which is great.
Okay.
But the question around bringing different parts of the council together to address this is a really kind of key one, and how to communicate between different departments. Maybe Elise and Yael, if you want to talk to your experience about that.
Sure, I'll jump in first, if you don't mind, Yael. I think meeting people where they're at and talking in their own language and appealing to what's in it for them. I was always interested to look at the emergency management policy or the health and wellbeing policy and see how many actions were actually climate actions, and being able to talk to them about how we could work together to achieve their action, which is actually also in the Climate Emergency Action Plan. So yeah, meeting people where they are and talking their language would be my advice.
Great, thank you. I have a question that was just asked, I guess, internally when I and Bart were going through preparing for this webinar was, please confirm that what councils are required to report under the 2 standards you mentioned, so that the ASRS and the ISSB that Matt was talking about. And the answer to that is that councils are required to manage and report on risks and also have their duty of care. But in Victoria and WA, they're specifically required to do this in relation to climate risk. So the 2 standards that were mentioned, the ASRS and the one with the very long acronym that they need to fix, don't they really? They provide a method by which councils can deliver this reporting, and I and Bark are working away to decipher that. I also know that state governments are also working hard to develop some guidelines. I do know we have some people from New South Wales State Government. And Gillian, can I call on you to talk about whether there's some level of interpretation happening at the state level? Okay, perhaps she's not there anymore. One question I have for Charlotte, as a lawyer, do you know of any instances of legal implications that have already affected councils? And just to preface, in the reference slides, we do have a Melbourne University link that profiles some of the council climate-related court cases. But Charlotte, do you have any specific examples about climate change litigation that have already occurred?
I think I'll start by saying that climate change is in itself rarely an argument that's sort of put forward in cases, especially relating to local government or authorities. But because, as we've sort of heard, climate change is now recognised as a reasonably foreseeable financial risk, there's lots of different heads of claim that cases are brought, but sort of specifically in the local government or council context, these normally relate to kind of like planning decisions or like sort of tortious matters like relating to negligence or nuisance. And in the plan decision approvals, heads of claim often, or in previous cases, climate, and if these have been approvals relating to, say, there's been a decision either to allow or not to allow a development on an area that's particularly exposed to climate risk, a climate hazard, whatever that might be, coastal inundation or fire or flood, and there's been applications to the court because either an approval has been made or not made. There's been sort of a number of instances where climate risk wasn't necessarily run, or climate change wasn't run as the main argument, but the court has sought to gather more information or infer climate change into the decision-making process. There's obviously sort of like potential exposure to liability if councils fail to take into account the likely effects of climate change when exercising a wide range of statutory responsibilities, including, as I just mentioned, the development approvals or the management of public infrastructure and public lands. There's a range of cases covering those planning approvals and also contractual disputes, and referring back to like lots of the material that we just heard and the great examples of sort of integrating climate risk into decision-making processes, that's the real sort of key to managing those risks.
Great, thanks so much, Charlotte. So one question I had from a colleague was, what is the biggest risk facing councils today? And it's not a simple answer. It depends where the council's located. Our climate change risk assessments that we've performed for a number of councils to date have found that bushfire, flooding, and extreme heat all generate the most extreme level of risk because they can result in death. That's more a short-term risk. And then you have those longer-term risks that are also very severe, like things like drought and, again, extreme heat that can directly impact on a community's resilience, and therefore local governments need to service those communities. So that's more the chronic long-term risk. I can see a question from Maria Baviera to Charlotte. Does the state government have the same potential liability that councils have on planning related decisions, such as failing to consider climate change in activity centre proposals and housing targets?
State governments have sort of similar obligations in their kind of like duty of care, and then certainly in Victoria, under the Climate Change Act, there are obligations to take into consideration climate change in sort of decision-making functions across the state government. And I think as the sort of the science and the knowledge around climate change, and there's so much greater understanding of the foreseeable risks and the hazards, the sort of legal adjudication on how decisions are made kind of looks at the reasonableness of that decision, the decision-making process, the sort of relevancy and up-to-date nature of the things that were taken into consideration during a decision, that it is becoming increasingly difficult, or would be increasingly difficult, to argue that that climate change should not and could not have been taken into a decision in circumstances where it isn't, for like in the state government context, would be really difficult. And there's been some, even though they're slightly different contexts in the local government authority context, but in the Murray-Darling River Basin Royal Commission, there was sort of some really strong language used about the failure of the authority to take into account climate change on a forward-looking basis. So not relying on historical or out-of-date data, but using, and as I think Matt mentioned, those kind of like different scenarios and forward-looking data to make those decisions on.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So I can see in the chat, Sally Bamber, thank you for sharing the New South Wales guidance. That's great. And Paul has shared the links to the actual reporting standards we've been talking about. Maria, given that your comment about cool spaces has been so popular, do you mind just turning your microphone on and talking a bit more about it? Okay, so we can't hear you. I'm not sure if you heard my request, but that's fine. We have hit the 1 p.m. mark. There's been some great chat, so thank you very much for that. And I haven't seen any other questions coming through. So thank you very much for coming. We'll be circulating a jot form survey, both for feedback on how our webinar was, and also so you can download the slides. So we've just posted the jot form in the link to our survey. So if you can please click on that. We'll also be profiling this on our website as well. So thank you very, very much for coming, everyone.
If anyone wants to stick around for further discussion, feel free. We're happy to chat.
Hi, this is Maria. Sorry, I just worked out how to put the microphone on because I'm using an iPhone.
Okay.
Yes, I've contacted the City of Campbelltown, who've got a really great toolkit that they've shared across South Australia and with some other councils, and I'll email it to everybody who specifically asked for it, but I'll also send it to you guys at Iron Bank if you want to send it to the list. But it
That'd
just
be great.
has project plan, checklists, how to audit buildings to see if the facilities are suitable. This is for cool spaces, which are cool refuges, and an engagement summary and a bit of a summary report that talks about how the first one went. So I'll make sure to share that. And sorry, it took me so long to find out how to press the speaking button. Cool. See ya.
Thanks so much, Maria.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
See you. Bye.
It looks like we might have a few people wanting to stick on. If you do have questions, you want to pop them in the chat now. That will help us just facilitate the discussion we have going forward. So feel free to chuck them in there. And
I can
also
see,
tell us where you're from, because that will also frame the discussion we can have a little bit.
Sure. Debbie Firestone from Tweed Shire has asked, Lise or Ironbark, how are you or councils tackling interdependencies of risks external to council? So any good methodologies to consider. So I think what Debbie's talking about are those compound hazards that then create a certain interdependencies with those risks. And it all sounds kind of complex. I think it's just when you're doing the risk assessment, being aware of those interdependencies. So kind of mapping which risks are likely to be interdependent, and also which hazards interplay. So one way to think about those hazards are the primary hazards, so an increased rainfall, and then the fact that and also increased storms and how that can incur, flash floods and high winds. And then yeah, it is complicated and it's hard to digest, but it's just about doing it step by step. And I think what we're going to be seeing, Debbie, is all councils are asking for it now, these multi-hazard risk assessments and making sure that interdependencies are highlighted and tracked. So I think what you're going to see emerging are more and more assessments that tackle that well. Has anyone else got anything to say on those interdependencies or compound hazards?
I would just say that what we found to be good is to do multiple passes over it. So you just do an initial mapping of where the hazards are and then look to see how they fall out and then examine those for where intersections might compound. So like I think it's, again, it feels like quite a lot of this work is if it's just applied systematically, where you just sort of go through the process and iterate through the tools, you can get to an outcome that has some clarity in what is otherwise a bit of a confusing space.
Great, thank you. I can see a question from Eng Lim. Hi, Eng. Your question is, how does this impact a remote regional outback council?
Yeah, I just want to add a bit of context to my question. I come from Shire, which is in southwest Queensland. We have a land area of about 67,000 square kilometers, which is the size of the whole island of Tasmania. But we have a population of less than 700 people. And in the recent March, in March, we have a very bad 1 in 50-year flood that obviously affected a lot of people, and we attracted a lot of media attention. Comes out in deadlines and other TV programs. So just wondering, how would this change in the is it a regulation or is it a law? I'm not too sure. I'm not a lawyer. How it would affect council like ours, and how much time do we have to prepare this?
Sure, Matt, do you want to answer that question?
Well, I think the situation is still developing, so I think clarity will come with time. Reflecting on how the ASRS approaches this question is that there is a strong expectation that the response will be proportional to the size, scale, and resources of the organisation.
Okay.
And so that means that the expectations around compliance are, modified, made more achievable for smaller scale organizations.
Okay.
So yeah, exactly how this relates to the service to public amenity and I think we'd see something similar. No one's expecting people to move impossible mountains or just to take on a hugely onerous additional administrative burden. So with the work that we're sort of looking at in the corporate space and the commercial space, the interesting question right now is how do mid-tier organizations respond? So we've got a reasonably clear understanding about how the larger orgs, the ones that are sort of in the first tranche, second tranche of the reporting requirements of the ASRS, how they're going to respond. But the more mid-tier, which will be drawn in through the third pass or maybe even just as third parties to reporting requirements through the ASRS scope 3 requirements. How they're going to do it, right? So something realistic, something that's not going to be we now need to dedicate 2/3 of our administrative resourcing to this purpose. So I think something along those lines, but you know, how that falls out is a little bit, you know, we're going to see how it unfolds.
And if you wanted to do some kind of preliminary exercise around climate risk assessments, Coast Adapt have a tool for a first pass risk assessment.
All right. Yeah.
Which is more or less a checklist, and that will kind of at least allow you to scope out what your key risks are.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. When you circulate when you circulate the slides, then it'll be good to put some contact details so I can follow up, and then I can also present or at least highlight to my counselors about this, and then from there I will get some guidance about how we proceed, as what Matt have just explained. You have some contact from the group that I can follow up after this meeting will be much appreciated. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Now I have someone, Alex Gout from Kaurna Country, related to Eng's question. Does the ASRS have a time frame in which councils have to comply? And what's the legality around compliance?
Okay, so councils don't have to comply with the ASRS, right? The ASRS is for corporations, and also not all corporations have to comply. So there's like this staged rollout. So we're currently in stage 1, which they refer to as tranche 1, and that's essentially organizations with an asset base of like $1 billion or over, annual turnover of 500 million, etc. There's going to be 2 more stages after this, and then that's it for the rollout. So it steps down sort of 2 further stages. Not all organizations will have a requirement to report. But because of the way ASRS works, which is that it creates expectations on emissions data and climate response information for supply chains, it's expected that most orgs in Australia will have some requirement to interact with the standard.
And so even if it's, sorry, you go.
No. What we...
Even if you're not reporting according to the Australian SRS standards, it will depend on what your local government acts say in terms of what councils are mandated to report on. So
yes, so that's where we see the movement. Yeah. So we're expecting that there will be an interpretation of the ASRS. And so we're currently seeing requirements for WA and for
Victoria.
Yeah, that's right. WA and Victoria. So, but this new interpretation of like how the ASRS will apply to government bodies which is currently still in development, but which we'll expect to see rolled out, it'll be some interpretation of that. So from what I've seen reading through the white paper, it's a pretty close alignment, and it's more just dealing with the fact that government bodies, like government, have a different set of responsibilities to an organisation, a standard commercial organisation, and it's mainly resolving those discrepancies or those differentials. Yeah, so I think we would expect to see it, but in regards to like what the timelines are, they're sort of being set at the state level. So what they'll look like.
Great. A question from Maria Anselmo. Do you know of anything coming up for Queensland local governments? I'm not specifically aware of any pending updates to the Local Government Act, but we do expect that to happen across all local governments, all states and territories, but nothing specific in the pipeline that we're aware of. We do often look at Queensland to their excellent risk assessment methodology in relation to coastal hazard management. So Matt in particular has been profiling amongst the Ironbark staff the coastal hazard adaptation strategy frameworks. And I know through that, and I've provided a link to all this in the slides, there's often funding available for Queensland local government risk assessments. Am I right saying that, Matt? The CHAS often attaches to funding.
Hi, Sorry to jump in there, but yes, they do have funding. It's Maria here. I
Hi,
put my
Maria.
camera on, but I would be sideways, and that might be
Okay.
confusing for people's eyes. But yes, there is funding that comes out of that program, and
Okay.
funding round just closed for them as well. And my question is more, I'm trying to find a like a motive to support delivering climate risk assessments. So I'm trying to see if there is from that, I guess, legal and also any sort of requirements through the Act.
Yeah.
If there's anything
Yeah.
I can do there to sort of get remote and regional councils on board with it.
I would say going back to the first slide that I presented on, which basically says that all local governments mandate a duty of care from their councils. And also, what was the other one? They're all required to do organisational wide risk assessments. So even though climate change isn't explicitly stated in all local government acts, apart from the West Australian and Victorian one, you have that mandated duty of care and mandate to avoid risk as an organisation, and also listed on that slide was the business risks of not acting.
Yeah, which
So I
was
think,
fantastic. I found that highly valuable. Thank you.
yeah, great. Thanks, Maria.
Sally, do you want to talk to what the Climate Emergency Australia has been doing in this space and the resources you mentioned? If she looks like she's still there, maybe she's not.
So Sally in her comment provided a good link to that Cooler Places Campbelltown initiative. So
sorry, I just had to dump my cat off my lap.
Oh.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that yeah, Kimberly gave a great rundown on the Cooler Places project in that webinar, so people are all welcome to access that and have a listen back. And there's a couple of other similar related talks within that webinar also about kind of heat related actions, and one's around urban planning. Sally Bamber, who was on the call earlier, speaks to that, and we've got Nellie Jamieson from Darebin talking about their work with public housing and in-house solutions. So nice kind of complementary approaches to helping people deal with heat.
Great, thanks so much, Sally.
And I also see Nina in the chat. I know she's done a lot of research on getting councils to collaborate on adaptation measures. Do you have anything else you would recommend sharing, Nina?
We're not being very lucky with our call out today. Like, all right. All right, well, I'm going to call it. I think we're done here. Our work is done. I can see some positive feedback already, so that's great. We'll email all registrations with that jot form that allows you to download our presentations. And thank you so much for coming.